Oh dear. Unfortunately, not a word I've said so far has been audible because I had my microphone muted. Oh my. Yes, you can tell we're amateurs. Okay. Well, Larry is having trouble accessing the show, so I'm trying to help him get in. You really haven't missed much. All I did was I said, welcome to the Invisible Hand Show live, although I'm the only one here right now. It is generally hosted by me, Lydia Glider Shelley, and Larry K. Mason, the author of this book, which, if you were watching while the microphone was muted, you saw me hold up something like this.
Bingo!
Ah, he's here. Yay! Welcome, Larry.
Touchdown on the moon.
Don't feel too bad because right before you got in, I realized that
my Voluntary Virtues Network is, well, I'm not getting any sound from you this time.
Well, my microphone was muted.
Because we're live. If you can hear me, nod your head. I cannot hear you.
Okay,
I'll go ahead and talk and see if you can figure out how to talk back.
Okay, you talk because I can hear you.
Oh, well.
You talk.
I'll go ahead and talk. I thought tonight, what with the circumstances going on in South Carolina, the extreme tragedy of the assassination of 9 parishioners at the Emmanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. The response to this, to me, has been very moving. I'm watching television on this several times. I found myself crying. For me, not that uncommon. I tend to be too sensitive. But it shows the depth of what was happening to me. The extreme generosity, understanding displayed by the families of the victims, the response of a descendant of Jefferson Davis, the woman who spoke as a member of the House of Representatives in the state of South Carolina, advocating that this was time that they could no longer have a symbol of hate and so forth. That inspired me. But I think that we need to look at this whole matter in context. And the context goes way back. Once upon a time, as they say, women invented agriculture. That far back, thousands of years ago. Once agriculture was invented, people found out how much really hard work you have to do to farm. Now, I don't know about most of you because I think most of you are quite a lot younger than I am, and farms have changed quite a lot since I was a young boy and worked on a farm. But I'm here to tell you that you spend many, many hours a day from before dawn till after dusk, even in the summertime, working really hard on the farm. You get sunburned, you get calluses, you get sore, and you don't have time for doing almost anything else. Now, if you're a farmer and your life depends on your being successful as a farmer, you have to produce the food and fiber and animal skins and milk and so forth from the products of your farm in order to survive. You're going to really like it if you can get somebody else to do the work. Now, one of the things you can offer to help other people decide to help you is money. After all, they can use the grain or the cows or whatever it is that passes for money in your agricultural economy. And they can work for you, and therefore you and they both will benefit. However, people don't like to give up money. So, of course, it occurred to many of the people who were who owned farms or who had land and were operating farms, that if they could get someone to work and didn't have to pay them, all they had to do was provide just barely enough to keep that person alive, and they themselves would not only not have to work nearly as hard, but they would have a much easier life in terms of they would have some wealth. They would have more food than they needed, or they would have luxury foods. They would have more comfortable clothing. They would have more better shelter, and so on. Well, this it seems to have been true of agricultural societies around the world, hundreds of the agricultural societies. And one way or another, this persuading other people to work for you and not paying them seems to have been discovered or employed by virtually all of those agricultural societies. If you had a farm which stayed in one place, then there's a very good chance that in your economy, in your society, there would be slavery. Now, it may not be exactly the same kind of slavery that existed in the South before the Civil War, but it would be one form of slavery or another. For example, if you were a man and you had a farm and you married, you would expect your wife to work on the farm, in addition, of course, to bearing children. And if she didn't, you had every right to beat her or otherwise mistreat her, to force her to work. Well, we don't think of that as slavery because, after all, she's going to become the mother of whoever inherits the farm, and she may therefore, I hope you can hear me, I've been lecturing all the while, because she is going to therefore be able to boss around her daughters-in-law. But the fact of the matter is that the slavery from captives, from other families, from just people who weren't going to get enough to eat unless they sold their children to you, or unless they themselves worked for you, and all you gave them was enough to keep them alive. This general approach was followed in Rome, it was followed in Greece. In fact, the Spartans followed it so firmly that everybody in the society was either a slave or slave master, because all of the army, all of the soldiers in Sparta were soldiers in order to suppress the pellets, the culture that was their slaves, and now outnumbered them about 10 to 1. That's what they were soldiers for. They had to all be soldiers because otherwise they would lose their slaves. Now, if you go to Greece, all those famous Greeks that you've heard about had slaves. Yes, they did. Servants who couldn't quit. So it was not at all surprising that there were slaves in the South, because after all, if you lived in the South and well, let me put it another way. If you've ever worked on a tobacco farm, you know darn right well you'd really rather not have to do that work. It is hot, it is sweaty, it is painful. You have long hours, your back gets sore, your hands get cut and chafed. It's really difficult work. Same thing goes for cotton. That was the industry that I worked in when I worked on the farm. I picked cotton, 2 cents a pound back when I was in the grade school. Yes, 2 cents a pound. And the farmer whose cotton I picked was the one who weighed the cotton, and he cheated me at the scales. So I've certainly got the slave point of view and attitude there. But be that as it may, it's only natural that people wanted slaves, because it seemed like this is how you could get something for nothing. You could get their work without having to pay for it. But think about it. Well, think quite a lot about it. Slave is not very productive. I mean, if you were a slave, would you work as hard as you could and produce as much as you could to make your master wealthy? Or would you work as little as you could get away with? Would you develop a reputation for being lazy and being slow and not briskly walking to work, but shambling slowly to work? And would you work really hard for that slave driver, or would you work just as little as you could get away with? Well, let's put it another way. That's how hard you work. What about how smart you work? Now, if you're a slave and you think of, hey, here's a way that I could produce twice as much. Well, would you tell your master? Would you tell the slave driver? Would you invent an improvement? What for? It wouldn't improve your life any. So you may think of a better way to do things, but yeah, why bother? So we find that people who are slaves are unproductive. They produce far less than people who are working for themselves. They produce far less and they do a poor job. The quality of their work is not as good. And to make it even worse, they don't discover and institute improvements. Therefore, if the society has slaves, it is reducing its productivity. It is making it less productive. Now, if a society is less productive, it should be less competitive with other societies. And it should have a lower standard of living overall than a society which did not have slaves and had a similar level of technology to start. And a society which does not have slaves probably is going to be able to put out in the field a much improved army or navy, if it's someplace like Athens, in order to fight its wars and avoid being conquered by other societies. North Korea, I see a note here, might as well be a whole nation of slaves. I hate to tell you this, but it almost is. Based on what little I have seen on TV about North Korea, it looks to me like that is a society in which there is a few people who are not slaves, and the vast majority of people are slaves. I doubt seriously that an improvement in production is going to improve their lot at all. And you'll notice that North Korea is not nearly as powerful and productive as South Korea. You should have told North Korea something when you consider that North Korea was the one that in 1950 had almost all the industry. But to get back to our Civil War situation, naturally, even though it made their society less wealthy, the money in that society was not evenly distributed at all. And now I'm not saying it had to be, every person had exactly the same amount of money, but I am saying that the money was clumped up such that a few people had an enormous proportion of the society's wealth, and the vast majority of people had just barely enough to get along. Now, it's true that the free dirt farmers in the South had a better life than the slaves. They lived better because they were able to keep all of their own production, and they were able to sell surplus production and thereby improve their lives. So it wasn't that they had no money at all. It wasn't they had no wealth. It wasn't that they weren't doing it all well. But there were a few wealthy landowners, planters as we might call them, although they didn't actually do any planting themselves. They did have a much higher proportion of the wealth than their own personal productivity in the American South is, than their own personal productivity would have appeared to warrant. After all, they weren't the experts in the main on how to do the planting and how to keep the crops in good shape and so forth. Now, given that the South therefore lived at a lower standard of living, and they had a circumstance in which they were less able to conduct a war, as was revealed by the Civil War itself, you'd have thought that if they had had good sense, they would have gotten rid of slavery because it would improve their own lot. That they could have therefore improved the amount of production they had, improved their standard of living, and if any benefit, any comfort to you or to them, they would not have had to worry about slave revolts, because one of the things that they were most worried about was the slaves revolting. So the South shot itself in the foot by having slavery and by maintaining a society based on slavery. So Civil War comes along. Why did we have the Civil War? Why did the South secede? Well, according to the Southerners who were in the legislatures and who voted to secede, the documents that they produced, such as their documents of announcing secession, told the rest of the country that they were seceding in order to protect and defend slavery, in order to keep their property, i.e. the slaves. And yes, that property, those slaves, were a substantial portion of their wealth. The land was cheap, slaves were expensive. And if somebody comes along and tells a slave-owning planter that he has to free his slave, that he has to, in effect, give away 90% of his wealth, he's not going to want to do that. So that was the situation. The Civil War was fought for the defense of slavery on the part of the South and part of the North to keep the South's production. There were economic reasons for the war. Now, this is no surprise. Almost all wars are fought for economic reasons. But in the South, the war ends, the slaves are freed, and miracle of miracles, we still have the same people farming the same land for the same people, but now they're tenant farmers. Oddly enough, even though they're no longer slaves, even though they can leave, there are still enough people who have a little enough power that the South is able to continue making itself poor by having a substantial portion of its population be unproductive. In other words, whether you're a wage slave or a plain, ordinary garden variety slave, if you are not very productive, it doesn't make much difference in your lifestyle. In fact, if you work harder and work smarter as a tenant farmer, you don't get to be a landowner. You just make the farmer whose land you are farming a little more wealthy. It doesn't benefit you in particular. Now, time passes. Jim Crow laws exist. The blacks in the South are oppressed. Blacks in the North are oppressed, just in a different fashion. And we get to the integration decision, Brown versus the Board of Education in Kansas. Needless to say, the South, all this time, and most of the people in the North, all this time, have been abusing blacks. Now, I don't mean abusing them by whipping them, although that happened, of course, during slavery, but they have been abusing them by exploiting them. Now, the human psychological phenomenon is that if you harm somebody, especially if you harm somebody who has never done anything to harm you, you will want to justify this. You will want to blame them. You will want to say they deserved it. And therefore, when the South lost the war, and when the South continued to exploit blacks via such oppression mechanisms as the Ku Klux Klan, they had to blame the blacks for what they were doing, for what the South was doing, what the powerful interests in the South were doing. They had to blame the blacks. Now, there were a number of benefits that accrued to the big money interests in the South by blaming the blacks that kept the whites from blaming the rich people for the whites who were poor being poor. But we'll bypass that. So, in the early 60s, several of the southern states brought back the Northern Virginia Army's battle flag because that was the one which most people recognized. That was one which people knew. They brought it back and they put it up in various prominent places as a way of saying to the federal government, we will not accept integration. We will resist you. We will be unconstitutional. We will violate the Constitution. We will oppress people because of their skin color, because we can get away with it, because we blame them for what we did to them all those hundreds of years. And therefore, the flag does not represent nobility of the South. It does not represent the high quality of the Southern soldier, and the Southern soldier was an excellent soldier. Many of the Southern generals were fine people. I point with a special pride to Robert E. Lee, head of the Army of Northern Virginia, a splendid gentleman, and he deserved the plaudits he has gotten. But he himself said, it's time to put the flag away. It is the flag of betrayal, of treachery, of traitors. And he was right. Now then, given that that is the case, the flag is now come down from the flagpole in South Carolina. Will blacks no longer be oppressed in South Carolina? Will blacks no longer be exploited? Will discrimination stop? No. There's big money in discrimination. There is big money in oppressing people. Big money for a few. Big money interests are able to maintain their advantages by oppressing. And if they can blame blacks for what they do to whites, for example, saying, you don't want to have affirmative action because that will force me to give somebody else your job. Well, that's ridiculous. The big money interests don't create jobs. Customers create jobs. If there are customers for a product, by gum, those big money interests will hire as many people to produce that product as they can, because that means more money for the big money interests. Therefore, when the South says, we want to maintain this flag to honor our ancestors, no, they don't. That's not why they want to put the flag up there. Many of their ancestors deserve a great amount of honor. They should be proud of those ancestors. We all should respect what those ancestors tried to accomplish, but not owning slaves, not oppressing the weak, not violating all the principles of human decency and trying to justify it by saying they deserved it. Okay, that's my speech. That's my spiel. If there are any questions that pop up on the screen, I'll be happy to attempt to answer them, but that's where it's coming from. What would changing over to new money do? It would mean that they'd end over a short period of time to discrimination. So hello.
Can you hear
me? Jason? I see a smile. I hope it's Jason. I can't hear Jason, but then I couldn't hear.
You can't hear.
I couldn't hear Lydia either. So since I'm only a minute or two left, I'm going to shut up and let Lydia talk.
Who can? I'm going to the chat room.
I hear nobody. I can see Jason's mouth moving, but I can't hear Jason at all.
I muted Jason when he first came on, but now I don't know how to undo it.
Well, at least we know that Jason is a handsome young man.
But he might have himself muted. I don't know. No?
And based on the clock on my computer, it looks like we're in the last minute of our time.
Yeah, we're down to the last little bit, although I do think
there's a thumb up.
The show after us.
Thumbs up for me too, Jason. Way to go. And thumbs up I see you from Lydia.
I keep speaking and forgetting you can't hear me.
Goodbye, one and all. See you next week. 2 weeks, 1 week. There we go. Okay.
One.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Same time, same place.
Same time, same place. Next week.
All right. Bye.